Actually, the first show that I played was the Ohio State Fair with about 20,000 people, you know, and I was extremely frightened.
You know that feeling when you think you know someone's whole story, but then something comes out that changes everything? That's exactly what happened when new details about Ricky Nelson's final days started coming to light. The golden boy of American television, the teen idol who made millions of hearts race in the 1950s, met an ending so tragic that Hollywood is still talking about it. But what they're saying now is very different from what we were told back in 1985. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand how shocking this really is, you need to know who Ricky Nelson was. Picture this. It's May 8th, 1940, and in a hospital in New Jersey, a baby boy is born to two of the biggest entertainment stars of the time. His parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, were already famous. His dad led a successful big band, and his mom was a beautiful singer who captured everyone's attention. Little Ricky came into a world of spotlights and applause, but nobody could have predicted just how bright his own star would shine. Here's the thing that most people don't realize about Ricky's childhood. He wasn't this confident, healthy kid you might imagine. Actually, he was a complete opposite. Ricky suffered from terrible asthma attacks that left him gasping for air at night. He was thin, sickly, and so shy that people described him as mysterious and hard to figure out. At night, his parents had to use a special vaporizer just so he could breathe easier while sleeping. Can you imagine? This fragile little boy would grow up to become one of the biggest names in rock and roll history. When Ricky was just 8 years old, something happened that would change his life forever. His parents' radio show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, needed the Nelson boys to join the cast. Up until then, professional actors had been playing young David and Ricky. But on February 20th, 1949, the real Nelson brothers stepped up to the microphones and started playing themselves. It sounds simple, but think about it. How many 8-year-olds have performed in front of millions of people? Ricky did it, and he did it week after week. The show was such a massive hit that it jumped from radio to television in 1952. And suddenly, America wasn't just hearing the Nelson family. They were watching them grow up right in their living rooms. Every single week, families across the country tuned in to see what Ozzie, Harriet, David, and Ricky were up to. It became one of the longest-running sitcoms in television history, lasting all the way until 1966. For 14 years, America watched Ricky Nelson transform from a scrawny kid with asthma into a handsome young man with dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. But here's where the story gets really interesting. In 1957, teenage Ricky did something that nobody expected. He picked up a guitar and sang on the show. Why? Well, the story goes that there was this girl he liked, and she was completely obsessed with Elvis Presley. So Ricky, trying to impress her, told her he was a singer too. The problem was, he wasn't. Not yet, anyway. So he rushed into a recording studio and cut a cover of Fats Domino's song called I'm Walkin'. And you know what happened? It became a huge hit. Nobody saw this coming. Sure, lots of TV actors tried to become singers back then, and most of them failed miserably. But Ricky Nelson was different. He actually had real musical talent. When his recording of I'm Walkin' came out, paired with another song called A Teenager's Romance, both tracks shot up the charts. In fact, the term teen idol was invented specifically to describe Ricky Nelson. Think about that for a second. He was so popular, so beloved by young fans, that they had to create a whole new phrase just for him. The hits just kept coming. From 1957 to 1963, Ricky Nelson placed over 30 songs in the top 40. His good looks combined with his gentle voice and natural charm made him unstoppable. Girls screamed when they saw him. They mobbed him wherever he went. At just 16 years old, he had a personal fortune worth $500,000, which would be worth millions and millions today. By the time he was 18, he was in one of the highest tax brackets in the entire country. Can you imagine being that rich and famous as a teenager? Hollywood noticed, of course. They cast him in a big-budget Western movie called Rio Bravo, where he starred alongside legends like John Wayne and Dean Martin. The movie was a massive success, and a lot of that was because of Ricky's incredible star power. The director even gave him several singing scenes in the film because he knew audiences loved hearing Ricky's voice. For a moment there, it seemed like nothing could go wrong for Ricky Nelson. He was on top of the world, living the American dream. But then the 1960s arrived, and everything started to change. For young men from Liverpool crossed the ocean and changed music forever. The Beatles led what people called the British invasion, and suddenly American rock and roll stars found themselves pushed aside. Even Elvis Presley struggled to compete with the Beatles' appeal. Ricky's star power, which had seemed so untouchable just a few years earlier, began to fade. It must have been terrifying for him, watching his career slip away while he was still so young. Desperate to stay relevant, Ricky came up with a plan. On his 21st birthday, he changed his professional name from Ricky to Rick. He wanted to shed that teenage idol image and become a more serious, mature artist. He grew his hair longer, started experimenting with different sounds, and moved toward what would later be called country rock. But it was an uphill battle. The music industry had moved on, and many people had already made up their minds about who Ricky Nelson was. Behind the scenes, Ricky's personal life was getting complicated too. In 1961, he started dating a young woman named Kristen Harmon. She was the daughter of a famous football player and came from a Hollywood family just like Ricky did. They had a lot in common, including quiet personalities and fathers who controlled their lives. They got married in April 1963, but Ricky later admitted it was basically a shotgun wedding because Kristen was pregnant. They would go on to have 4 children together, including a daughter named Tracy and twin sons Gunnar and Matthew. The marriage was trouble from the start. Both Ricky and Kristen had grown up in the spotlight, surrounded by fame and money, but neither of them really knew how to handle normal life. They spent money like it would never run out. Expensive vacations, sports cars, home renovations, constant shopping. Ricky didn't even write his own checks until he was in his 40s. Business managers handled everything. And the crazy thing is, despite all his touring and recording, Ricky's music career was actually losing money. By the mid-1970s, he was in serious financial trouble. In 1977, Kristen filed for divorce. The split was messy and painful, and it left Ricky scrambling to pay the bills. He had to tour constantly, playing anywhere that would book him. Sometimes that meant big college shows where he could reach younger audiences who didn't remember his teen idol days. Other times, it meant playing in small bars and supper clubs, which must have felt like such a come down for someone who had once filled arenas and starred in Hollywood movies. Here's something that will break your heart. During his marriage, Ricky had affairs with over 1,000 women, by his own estimate. He used touring as an escape from his unhappy home life and his responsibilities as a father. Meanwhile, Kristen was having her own affairs too. The whole situation was just sad and destructive. These were 2 people who had everything the world could offer, but they couldn't find happiness together. By the early 1980s, Ricky was trying to make a comeback. He added the Y back to his name, becoming Ricky again. He released a compilation album of his greatest hits and went on tour with Fats Domino, the same artist whose song had launched his career all those years ago. There was hope in the air. Maybe, just maybe, Ricky Nelson could reclaim some of his old glory. But there was a problem. Ricky hated flying. He really, truly hated it. But he also refused to travel around the country in a tour bus. So in May of 1985, he made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. He bought an old airplane, a Douglas DC-3 that had been built way back in 1944 during World War II. The plane was over 40 years old. It had been owned by several people over the years, including the rock and roll legend Jerry Lee Lewis. Ricky paid $118,000 for it. Now, this is where things get really troubling, and this is a part that has shocked Hollywood all these years later. That plane had serious problems. In June of 1985, just 1 month after Ricky bought it, one of the engines failed during flight. The pilot had to make an emergency landing in Lancaster, California. Think about that. The plane failed so badly it couldn't even complete a flight. But somehow, Ricky kept using it. Band members complained about the aircraft constantly, joking nervously about what piece would fall off next. They knew something was wrong, But the tour had to go on. There's something even more disturbing that investigators discovered later. The plane was never properly registered under Ricky's name after he bought it. According to Federal Aviation Administration records, the paperwork was never completed correctly. So here you have a famous entertainer fly around the country in an old military transport plane with mechanical problems and questionable legal status. It's the kind of thing that makes you want to scream at the past and beg them to stop. The final tour began after Christmas in 1985. Ricky and his band, called the Stone Canyon Band, played a show in Orlando, Florida. Then they flew to Guntersville, Alabama, where they performed at a small club owned by a friend. The show went well. Ricky sang and joked with the audience, happy to be performing. After the show, everyone settled into their hotel rooms, preparing for the next leg of the journey. The next morning, they would fly to Dallas for a big New Year's Eve concert at a hotel. It was supposed to be a celebration, a fresh start to a new year. But that morning, there were problems with the plane. A fuel primer wasn't working right, and mechanics had to fix it. The repair took 4 hours, so Ricky and his band waited around the airport terminal, playing video games and eating lunch. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, they boarded the plane and took off. Everything seemed fine at first. The old DC-3 lifted into the sky and headed toward Texas. What happened next has been the subject of investigation and debate for decades. Somewhere during the flight, a fire started in the back of the plane. The pilots noticed smoke filling the cabin. Some witnesses on the ground later said they saw flames while the plane was still in the air. The pilots tried desperately to make an emergency landing, aiming for a small landing strip near DeKalb, Texas. They almost made it. The plane came down in an open field, barely missing a farmhouse, hitting 2 electrical poles and several trees on the way down. The time was 5:14 in the afternoon on New Year's Eve, 1985. When the plane hit the ground, it was already filled with smoke and starting to burn. The 2 pilots, Brad Rank and Ken Ferguson, managed to climb out to the cockpit windows. They were badly burned but alive. They shouted back to the passenger cabin, trying to get the others to follow them out, but there was no response. The smoke was too thick, the fire too fast. The pilots backed away from the plane, terrified it would explode. All 7 passengers died. Ricky Nelson, just 45 years old, was gone. So was his girlfriend, Helen Blair, who had been planning to marry him. The entire Stone Canyon Band, all the musicians who had been making music with Ricky, died in that smoke-filled cabin. The sound technician, a young man named Clark Russell, died too. 7 lives ended in that field in Texas, just miles from where they were supposed to land safely. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and painful. Rumors started spreading almost instantly. Some people whispered that drugs had caused the crash, claiming that Ricky or his band members had been freebasing cocaine on the plane. These rumors were cruel and completely false, but they spread like wildfire anyway, tarnishing Ricky's memory during his family's darkest hour. His children, Tracy, Matthew, and Gunnar, had to defend their father's name while they were still grieving. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a full investigation that took over a year. What they found was shocking and infuriating. The fire had started in the right rear part of the cabin, probably near the floor. The most likely cause? A faulty cabin heater. That's right, the very heater that band members and pilots had been struggling with during the flight. One of the pilots later admitted that they had tried repeatedly to turn the heater on and off, and it wasn't working properly. He even said he told his co-pilot at one point, "Don't tell anyone about the heater." But here's the part that makes this truly heartbreaking. The investigation found that the pilots didn't follow proper emergency procedures. When they realized there was smoke in the cabin, they opened fresh air vents instead of keeping them closed. They didn't tell the passengers to use supplemental oxygen masks. They didn't try to fight the fire with the extinguisher that was sitting right there in the cockpit. The investigators said these steps might not have prevented the crash, but they would have given the passengers a much better chance of survival. The medical examiner's report painted an even grimmer picture. All 7 passengers had died from smoke inhalation, not from the impact of the crash. Their bodies were found crowded at the front of the plane, showing they had been desperately trying to escape the smoke and flames. They were so close to the cockpit, so close to safety, but the smoke overcame them before they could get out. If the pilots had acted differently, if they had helped the passengers, things might have turned out differently. Even more troubling, investigators noted that the plane itself had a long history of problems. Under Ricky's ownership, it had experienced multiple mechanical failures. The engine failure back in June should have been a massive red flag. The fact that band members were openly joking about the plane falling apart should have stopped everything right there. But the pressure to tour, the need for money, the demands of the entertainment industry, all of it pushed everyone forward even when warning signs were flashing red. There were other tragic ironies, too. The last song Ricky performed on stage, just hours before the crash, was Rave On by Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly had also died in a plane crash, and Rave On was the last song he performed before his death. It's the kind of coincidence that sends chills down your spine. And Ricky's body was lost in transit from Texas back to California, arriving late to his own funeral. His loved ones joked sadly that Ricky was always late to everything, something they called Nelson Standard Time, and somehow he managed to be late even to his own funeral. The aftermath brought even more pain to an already devastated family. Kristen, Ricky's ex-wife, threatened to sue for part of his life insurance money, even though their divorce agreement said it should go to their children. She tried to take control of his estate from his brother David, who had been named administrator in Ricky's will. This caused terrible tension at the funeral. Helen Blair's parents wanted her buried next to Ricky at Forest Lawn Cemetery, but Harriet Nelson refused. The Blairs ended up filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Ricky's estate and eventually received a small settlement. As the years passed and people looked back at what happened, a darker picture emerged. This wasn't just an unfortunate accident. This was negligence. This was a system that failed. Ricky Nelson was a beloved entertainer who deserved to be protected. But instead, he was flying around in a dangerous aircraft that should never have been in the air. The people responsible for his safety, the pilots and the plane's maintenance crew, had let him down in the most catastrophic way possible. What makes this even more painful is knowing that Ricky was on the verge of a real comeback. Just a month before his death, he had toured England and played 2 shows at London's famous Royal Albert Hall. The audiences loved him. He had signed a new record deal. There was talk of a new television series. After years of struggling, things were finally starting to look up, and then it was all taken away in a field in Texas because a heater caught fire in a plane that should have been grounded. The music world lost something special that day. Ricky Nelson wasn't just a teen idol who got lucky. He was a genuine pioneer of rock and roll. He helped create what we now call country rock, mixing traditional country sounds with rock and roll energy years before other artists made it mainstream. Bob Dylan himself wrote about Ricky's influence in his memoir. In 2004, Rolling Stone magazine ranked Ricky Nelson as number 91 on their list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. Not bad for someone people dismissed as just a teen idol. In 1987, less than 2 years after his death, Ricky Nelson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was the only former child television star to receive that honor. Critics and fans who had once dismissed him as a lightweight finally recognized his real contributions to music. But Ricky never got to see that recognition. He never got to know that history would treat him kindly, that his music would endure, that future generations would discover his songs and fall in love with them. His children have carried on his legacy. Tracy Nelson became a successful actress. His twin sons, Matthew and Gunnar, formed their own rock band called Nelson and had hits of their own in the 1990s. They've spent their lives defending their father's memory and making sure people know the truth about what happened that New Year's Eve. They've made it clear that their dad wasn't some out-of-control rock star who died because of drugs. He was a hard-working musician who died because of mechanical failure and human error. The story of Ricky Nelson is ultimately a story about the price of fame and the dangers of putting profit over safety. It's about a talented kid who grew up in front of the whole country, who handled incredible success and devastating failure, who made mistakes but kept trying to do better. And it's about how the entertainment industry can chew people up and spit them out, caring more about the next show than about protecting the people who make the magic happen. Today, 40 years after that tragic crash, We know so much more than we did back then. We know that those early rumors about drugs were lies. We know that the plane had a documented history of mechanical problems. We know that proper safety procedures weren't followed. We know that Ricky Nelson and 6 other people died unnecessarily, killed by negligence and bad decisions and a faulty heater in an old plane that never should have been flying. The next time you hear one of Ricky Nelson's songs, whether it's Hello Mary Lou or Traveling Man or Garden Party, take a moment to remember the whole story. Remember the sickly kid with asthma who became a superstar. Remember the teenager who invented the modern teen idol. Remember the musician who helped create a whole new genre of music. Remember the father who made mistakes but loved his children. And remember that his death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a preventable tragedy that shocked Hollywood to its core and still haunts us decades later. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it helped you understand who Ricky Nelson really was beyond the headlines and the rumors, then do me a favor. Hit that like button below. Share this video with someone who loves music history or who needs to hear the truth about what happened that terrible New Year's Eve. And please subscribe to this channel so you can learn more stories like this one. Stories about the real people behind the famous faces. Stories that Hollywood doesn't always want you to know. The truth matters, and Ricky Nelson's legacy deserves to be remembered accurately and with respect. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.